Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Skyfall. So I am wrapping up this little mini Bond series of reviews that I've been doing recently. I want to thank all of the subscribers I've gotten as a result of these reviews. It's the most I've gotten since I've started this channel in such a short amount of time. All the likes, comments, and the subscribes, I mean, honestly, really means so much to me. I'm getting close to that 3,000 mark, which is a big deal for an up-and-coming YouTube channel. So, honestly, big thank you to everybody who has watched my videos. I'm hoping you will continue to watch them, and I hope you enjoy all the other movies that I plan on talking about. I will definitely return to the Bond movies again in the future. This is a very important franchise to me, and I have so many opinions and hot takes and on this franchise that I will definitely return to talking about more Bond movies in the future. But like I said, I have a bunch of other movies that I want to talk about, and I wanted to end this series on a high note. I want to talk about a movie that I think celebrates Bond and highlights why I love this series so much, and Skyfall is one of those movies for me. Now, while prepping for this video, and something that I've just noticed in the past couple of years anyway, Skyfall is a movie, while yes, it is routinely named by many fans as being one of the best Bond movies, there's a lot of love and support that this movie has garnered. There's also been a lot of critics of this movie in the Bond fandom, and this is one of the Bond movies that I see routinely get named as being the most overrated Bond movie. In fact, when I was doing my Die Another Day review, I posted that on a James Bond group that I'm a part of, and it had the title "The Dumbest Bond Movie Ever." And one of the comments I got where they're like, "I don't know. I think the dumbest Bond movie ever is probably Skyfall." I was like, "What? What are you talking about? Like, how is Skyfall even remotely the dumbest Bond movie?" And he wrote back this crazy long response that I'm like, I'm not reading all of that. Of the most superficial bullshit complaints about Skyfall. It's like, oh, it's got plot holes, it rips off other movies, Daniel Craig fucking sucks, he's the worst Bond ever, Casino Royale's also super... Like, there's a lot of vitriol against Daniel Craig as Bond. Now, I'm a big Daniel Craig Bond fan. I think even if his movies aren't the most consistent, Casino Royale, awesome. Quantum of Solace, sucks. Skyfall, awesome. Spectre, sucks. No Time to Die is kind of both kind of awesome and also sucks at the same time, with the first half of that movie being great and the second half totally going off a cliff, in my opinion. As far as his portrayal of the character, it is by far the most accurate to the way Ian Fleming wrote the character. And like I mentioned in my Timothy Dalton Bond reviews, that was the precursor to Daniel Craig, and by the time we got to Daniel Craig, Casino Royale is like, that's how Ian Fleming always thought of Bond. If you've ever read an Ian Fleming Bond book, Daniel Craig, he's the one that portrays that the most accurately. So it's interesting that there are so many Bond fans that hate Daniel Craig because he's depressing, he's too serious. It's like, yeah, that's who James Bond is in the books. I realize in movies he has a completely different persona. But it is interesting that Daniel Craig gets a lot of hate as Bond when I think, you know, he's one of the best. He's a really, really great actor, and he gives Bond a level of depth that other Bonds just don't have. One of the things that I feel like doesn't get mentioned enough when talking about this movie is that Skyfall specifically came out during the 50th anniversary of Bond. It was made to commemorate the 50th anniversary and to honor the legacy, the cinematic legacy that Bond has garnered since Dr. No starting in 1962. And so what Skyfall does essentially is it bridges the gap between modern Bond and classic Bond. And it does so in a way that honors the character it's one of the reasons why it's one of my most rewatched Bond movies, is because it's a love letter to the series as a whole. This is the Bond movie where we bring back Moneypenny, we bring back Q, we bring back the Aston Martin DB5, we have a villain that's very reminiscent of classic Bond villains that Sean Connery and Roger Moore went up against, kind of that larger-than-life type of Bond villain. We bring back awesome, cheesy one-liners.
It's the circle of life.
It feels like a classic Bond movie, but through the lens of the modern Bond era. On top of that, it's probably the best looking Bond movie, thanks to Sam Mendes's terrific direction, but mostly Roger Deakins' incredible cinematography. He's my favorite cinematographer ever. It's why Blade Runner 2049 is my favorite science fiction film of all time. Visually, that movie's amazing, and Skyfall, really no different. The visuals are fucking outstanding. It's crazy how beautiful this movie is. Similar to that of Casino Royale, we're getting a really meaningful character arc with Bond, in that we're after the beginning of this movie where he's going after a mercenary who has the hard drive of secret identities of NATO agents, accidentally gets shot by Moneypenny. He effectively dies, right? And then he comes back and he has retirement, more or less. He's now dealing with the physical and mental toll of being a spy, getting older in a world that is continuing to evolve. The character arc that Bond has to deal with in Skyfall is directly related to Skyfall being the 50th anniversary of Bond, and it questions whether or not a character like Bond can continue in a world that's constantly evolving. This is something that was even brought up in GoldenEye, between that conversation with Judi Dench and Pierce Brosnan, where she's like, I think you're a sexist, misogynistic dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War. A lot of critics at the time thought Bond was the same, and they wondered if Bond could even continue to be a relevant movie character. Skyfall answers that same question, and it shows it cinematically through Craig's arc in this movie. And I think it works really, really well. It's quite effective. And by the time we get to the end of this movie, where it is like a throwback to the Connery era of Bond, where Bond comes in, flirts with Moneypenny, gets his debriefing from M, I mean, that's the movie saying Bond will always live on, regardless of a constantly evolving world. As long as Bond continues to reinvent himself and we keep getting really great high quality movies like Skyfall or Casino Royale and stuff like that, and there's an audience that is always supportive of that, Bond will always live on. That's what I get from the ending of this movie. Others might feel differently, but that's the interpretation that I get. So there's that aspect of Skyfall. There's the visuals, there's Daniel Craig's very emotional and vulnerable portrayal as Bond. We also get to see his backstory and his origin story in a way that we've never seen in any of the other Bond movies when we get to the climax of this film. And by the way, the critique of the climax of this movie is something that annoys me to no end. People thinking that they're clever for saying, hey, it's exactly like Home Alone. You're not clever for saying the same thing that Honest Trailer says. You're not. And I'm going to talk about why the ending of Skyfall is actually awesome. So while Daniel Craig's version of Bond has his character arc, we bring in M, a character that has always been a bit of a side character and a plot device in pretty much every other Bond movie except for this one. And Judi Dench gives an amazing performance and has a moral complexity similar to that of Bond, where these two characters know the difference between right or wrong, and yet they're constantly put in situations where they have to do wrong things in order to get the right results. And with M, because she's the head of MI6 and all of this, she has to make the call about basically which agents can live and which ones die in order for her to succeed with her mission, and she can't be empathetic. She has to keep her mind in the game, similar to that of James Bond. Her actions result in creating a crazy rogue agent by the name of Silva, played brilliantly by Javier Bardem, where his entire motivation is going after and getting revenge on M for treating him as an expendable spy, and him getting tortured, and him trying to take the cyanide to kill himself but accidentally surviving it and it injuring him horrifically. It's a really great motivation that gives M a surprising amount of depth that we've never seen in the Bond series before. And there's also the interesting relationship between Bond and Silva, in that they're basically two very similar characters but with very different outcomes, where this is what Bond could have been. Right? He could have ended up like somebody like Silva, but instead he endured and overcame that. The triangle relationship between Silva, M, and Bond, that's the center of this movie. And it elevates it to another level while also giving us all of the classic Bond stuff. We get a great Bond opening. We get a great opening action sequence. We get fantastic set pieces throughout this movie. And because it's all photographed by Roger Deakins, the set pieces look more beautiful than in any other Bond movie ever. I think my favorite scene in any of the Bond movies ever of the entire franchise is the scene where Bond is in Shanghai. He's going after the mercenary who stole the hard drive that contained the secret identity of all the other NATO agents. He's following him. They go into like this remote high tower building where it's completely dark and isolated, but there's these neon lights that's lingering that just adds this level of beauty and noir aesthetic that is just gorgeous. He does an assassination, shoots a guy in the head, and then him and Bond are fighting, and there's that amazing scene where you just see their silhouettes fighting each other, and the camera is not doing anything except just panning in very slowly. And just that entire scene, the build up to that scene, it's probably my favorite just in terms of visual storytelling of the entire Bond franchise. I fucking love that scene. Then there's the whole casino sequence, which is, you know, Bond coming in on a boat. We see the fireworks, and God, visually, just this movie just looks so good. We get introduced to the main Bond girl of this movie, which that is a complaint that I think is somewhat valid. The Bond girl in Skyfall is kind of weak in comparison to other Bond girls throughout the franchise, although I absolutely love that scene where it's very intimate and it's just Bond and her and they're just talking, and he talks about how those bodyguards are controlling her, they're not protecting her, and all this stuff. And that is a really brilliantly photographed scene that just feels intimate and has a tension that's you can feel throughout it. Really, really well executed. But as a whole, she is a means to an end. She is one of those Bond girls that's essentially a plot device to get Bond from point A to point B. Basically going from the casino to meeting Silva on that remote, like abandoned town island where he has his headquarters, which once again, that feels like a very classic Bond thing. You know how, you know, classic Bond villains have their evil layers, like Blofeld in You Only Live Twice has the volcano lair. I think Silva having his own like abandoned island as his like home base is very classic Bond stuff that I think is a really cool visual and a unique set piece that stands out in the series. But admittedly, yeah, she's a weaker Bond girl, and the fact that she was, you know, sex trafficked and Bond ends up having, you know, a sex scene with her in the shower, it comes off as a little distasteful. So I think that is a valid criticism of the movie. It's not great, but everything else, you know, Bond's character arc is satisfying. His relationship with M is more emotionally charged than it's ever been in the series before, which I think is wonderful. And then we get to the climax of this movie, which is, like I mentioned before, I get really annoyed when people think they're clever for quoting honest trailers and saying, oh, this movie, the end's exactly like Home Alone. It's virtually the exact same thing. No, it fucking isn't. In the context of the story, it makes sense because Silva has always been one step ahead of both Bond and M, you know, with his computer hacking skills and all this stuff. And that's another critique I hear about the movie. It's like, oh, Silva's plan doesn't make sense. He's basically like the Joker. He gets captured on purpose and all that stuff. You know, yeah, I can definitely agree that that plan is similar to that of the Joker, and there are logical issues with that plan, but we're talking about a Bond movie. How many Bond movies have logical issues? How many Bond movies are there where Bond gets trapped by the bad guy that is easily escapable, where the bad guy could just shoot him with a gun instead?
I have a gun in my room. You give me 5 seconds, I'll get it. I'll come back down here, boom, I'll blow their brains out.
Scott, you just don't get it, do you? You don't.
Like, why is this Bond movie held in such high standards when it comes to that stuff, and other Bond movies aren't? Is what I find fascinating. I was talking to a guy who said GoldenEye was his favorite Bond movie and that he fucking hated Skyfall. I was like, you don't think GoldenEye doesn't have plot holes? You don't think it doesn't really make a lot of sense that 006 was able to fake his death by getting shot in the head and then surviving an explosion while also creating a secret terrorist organization to get a fictional space weapon that can financially destroy all of England while also stealing all the money? Like, are you seriously going to tell me that GoldenEye doesn't have plot holes that are glaring similar to that of Skyfall? Like, give me a break. But regardless, Silva has been one step ahead and he uses technology to do this, okay? So Bond has an idea of getting M, using M as the bait, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for Silva to follow, going back to his origins, which is something we've never seen in any of the Bond movies, in Scotland, which is clearly a loving homage to Sean Connery, the first Bond, and having the plan of, look, we're going to take Silva out of his element, okay? And we're going to use the resources that we have here that are very limited. Bond is going to use his wit, which no matter how many gadgets Bond has, the number one superpower that Bond has always had is his wit. So him using his limited resources, using his butlers, essentially his version of Alfred Kincaid, played by Albert Finney, who is awesome in this movie, they're going to get one step ahead of Silva. And so it really annoys me that entire buildup, which is brilliant and genuinely suspenseful when Bond is like, are you ready? because they're here. And we see the bad guys slowly approaching the estate. And like, you're telling me that you're not on the edge of your seat when you watch that? Because I sure as hell am. I find that scene exciting and visceral as hell. And then when Bond, you know, blows up the estate and we see like the orange glow in the background as Bond is desperately running to go catch up with M to make sure Silver doesn't kill her. And he's running on the frozen lake, and then he takes the bad guy who's with him, shoots a hole in the lake to prevent Silva from killing him, using that flare to get up to the surface. I mean, like, you're telling me that amazing action sequence that is gritty and grounded in a way that we've never seen in any other Bond movie, that is photographed beautifully, like one of the best looking sequences in any of the Bond movies. You're telling me it's like, oh, it's lame because it's just like Home Alone. Get the fuck out of here. It's so stupid. When we get to the ending of this movie and Silva, you know, gets killed by Bond after he has that really intense moment with M, he's going to kill himself with M and all this stuff, this really crazy grand operatic type of death. You know, Bond shows up, throws a knife in his back, says that one great line to him that was a reference to his whole analogy about how both him and Bond are rats that are forced to eat each other. We get a genuinely touching sequence between M and Bond. Then we get the epilogue of this movie where it's Daniel Craig entering the classic Bond era, but for a modern era. That is a lovely tribute to the entire Bond franchise as a whole. That's why I love Skyfall. I think I love it because it bridges that gap between modern Bond and classic Bond. I love the visuals of the movie. I love the action sequences of the movie. I love, similar to that of Casino Royale, we get to see a human side of Bond that's not common in this series. We get to see a human side of M that's not common in this series at all, and that elevates the movie as a whole for me. I think Silva is a great and truly memorable villain. While, yes, the movie certainly has plot holes, and, you know, you can argue whether or not those plot holes ruin the movie for you. I mean, for me, when it comes to plot holes in general, the only time they really bother me is when I'm not engaged with the story. As long as I'm engaged with the story, and I care about the characters, and I'm fully in it, then I don't really care about plot holes so much. I mean, one of my favorite movies of all time is Terminator 2, Judgment Day. And because that movie deals with time travel, there are so many plot holes that you can nitpick in that movie. Are you going to tell me that there are people out there that can't enjoy Terminator 2 because, oh, the way they use time travel, it's ridiculous, doesn't even make sense? It's like, dude, as long as you care about the characters and you're along for the ride with the movie and you're engaged, who gives a shit? But that's my thoughts on Skyfall. I love this movie. It's probably my second favorite Bond movie behind Casino Royale. As far as Craig's other Bond movies, which I will most likely talk about in the future, I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on those, but I still think he was a great Bond. So, you know, haters are going to hate. What are you going to do? But I want to hear your guys' thoughts. What are your thoughts on Skyfall? Do you love it? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Mention it in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.